Hello, everyone, and a huge welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's webinar. After 5 years of Brexit, what lies ahead? I'm your chair, Ellie Chowns. I'm the Green MP for North Herefordshire. I also previously served as a member of the European Parliament, and I've been a long-time supporter of and campaigner for closer relationships with Europe. So we've just marked 5 years since Britain left the EU. Tonight, we're going to assess how UK-EU relations stand at the moment and look ahead to what the next 5 years could hold for restoring greater cooperation between Britain and the EU. So the discussion will cover concrete actions for the government to consider in its ongoing reset with the EU, as well as possible routes towards more ambitious, long-term progress towards rejoining, as well as the strategies and opportunities that pro-European campaigners need to be pursuing to help make this happen. Now, on our panel this evening, we have three fantastic speakers. We've got Anand MENON. Anand is a political scientist. He's Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. In 2014, Anand was appointed as Director of UK in a Changing Europe, and he was also a Special Advisor to the House of Lords EU Committee. Next, we've got Alexandra Hall. Alexandra is a former British diplomat, serving notably as British Ambassador to Georgia from 2013 to 2016, and as Brexit Counsellor at the British Embassy in Washington from 2018 to December 2019. Mark Kieran is CEO of Open Britain, a pro-EU campaign group set up in the aftermath of the 2016 European Union referendum of 2016. And Mark is also a political strategy consultant. And before I pass over to tonight's speakers, I just have a spot of housekeeping to do. You can ask your questions to the speakers in the chat, starting right from now, and we'll get to as many as we can in the Q&A session, which will come after our speakers have each had a chance to speak. When you're typing your question, please could you say which speaker the question is for? That helps us manage it. We'll be bringing those questions up onto the screen during the Q&A session, and that'll begin just after 7 o'clock. We'll aim to wrap up the webinar promptly at 7:30. If you cannot put your question in the chat for accessibility reasons, then you can email your question to events@europeanmovement.co.uk. Please also know that this webinar is being recorded and we are streaming live right now on YouTube. The webinar is going to be available on the European Movement's YouTube channel from tomorrow, and we'll be sending the link around when it's ready. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to bring in Anand MENON, our very first speaker. Anand, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Ellie. And I should preface my remarks with two comments. The first is I've been asked to talk about the future, and I'm almost always wrong when I talk about the future. So just bear that in mind. My predictions are generally never any good. And the second caveat, I suppose, is that Donald Trump potentially changes everything. And it's too soon to know how he's going to change things, but he's going to change the world we live in. We've seen that with Ukraine already. He's also going to change where Britain feels it is, because whether Britain is forced to end up doing what it has tried to avoid for the whole of the post-war period, which is choose between Europe and the United States, is going to be down to how that relationship between the UK and the US, but also the US and the EU develops. So that we don't know what's going to happen, but they're going to affect things profoundly. If we're going to talk about the reset and the state of EU-UK relations at the moment, the first thing I'd say is there is, I think, a growing sense of frustration on the European side that a government that promised so much has delivered so little. And by that, I mean, there was a lot of talk before the election, and EU officials say that actually in private, Labour shadow ministers were very effusive about how much they wanted to achieve in the UK-EU relationship. But subsequent to the election, what we found is the government has not provided any further detail beyond the skeleton it provided in its manifesto. Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Minister for Relations with the European Union, has become very adept at giving lovely sounding speeches that reveal nothing. And on the European side, I think there's an increasing sense we need to know what these people want. There's no point saying you want an SPS deal. What kind of SPS deal? What will it cover? What will it look like? And the other thing about the delay, I think, and it's very striking that the UK only in January appointed its EU Sherpa months in. And I think the other thing that the delay has meant is that the EU has managed to get its ducks in a row first. And what we've seen is there are two very clear asks from the EU side, both in one sense trivial, but still capable of being deal breakers. The first is youth mobility, which I'll come back to, and the second is fisheries. And whilst we might roll our eyes about fisheries because of their economic triviality, we have French elections in the not too distant future. And politically in the UK, which I'll also come back to, fisheries are important because the Labour government is very concerned about the threat from reform in coastal communities. So we're in a situation where we're waiting, and the European Union is waiting to hear what the UK wants. I think the one area where progress will be relatively easy is security, or at least the easy bits of security. I think when the summit comes around, the UK and the EU will be able to sign an agreement whereby they meet more, they do more exchanges, they exchange more information. The key thing to watch for, I think, is when it comes to the economics of security. The really big issue in UK-EU security relationships are the new schemes that the EU has launched to promote military capability development amongst its member states. There's a little bit of money, not a huge amount, but a significant amount nonetheless. And at the moment, member states who aren't in the single market are denied access to this. I think in the current security situation, it is absolutely crucial that some sort of deal is found, because if Europe is serious about being strategically autonomous, then I think they will need the UK defence industry as part of that. So in negotiating that deal will be difficult. There's still a degree of opposition in the European Union to opening those schemes up, but watch that space. On the economics, all I can say is what Labour are asking for is very, very limited. Three things broadly: the rights of creative artists to tour more easily, mutual recognition of professional qualifications, and an agricultural deal. The first has already been ruled out on several occasions by the EU, and they're not going to change their minds on that. Touring artists and freeing up travel for touring artists requires chipping away at bits of the single market and the customs union that the EU just won't do. Mutual recognition might happen. It'll take many years. It won't be a quick fix. Those negotiations always take ages. And on SPS, one of the things I think we forget in this country is we need to persuade the EU why they should bother negotiating. The EU is quite happy with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement as an economic agreement. They don't particularly see the need to change it. We are going to have to give them some incentive to start talking about bringing down barriers to trade in agricultural products. The one thing that unites all those three things, I think, is their overall economic impact will be trivial. And the fact of the matter is the costs of Brexit reside in being outside the customs union and the single market. And they, of course, are Labour's red lines. And I think there's very little prospect of those red lines being breached because Labour is obsessed with the politics. And the politics matters, partly, as I've said, because they are obsessed with the threat from reform, which is making them sensitive about coastal seats. They're also very worried about winning back the blue-collar workers they failed to get back despite their massive electoral victory last July. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why Labour are a little bit nervous about youth mobility, because for many in Labour, if you start talking about freedom of movement, and let me be clear, youth mobility isn't freedom of movement, but bear with me, they see that as something that was done for the middle class to the working class. That is to say, while people like I benefit from freedom of movement because my kids can do gap years, I can travel around Europe giving lectures without paperwork, for your average plumber, it means competition and potentially dangerous competition in your marketplace. And I think Labour are sensitive when it comes to mobility, not to make it look like something for our kids. I think that's going to be presentational. I think you can do something around apprenticeships that would work, but that explains, I think, the political resistance in the Labour Party to doing something on mobility. And the problem with that is increasingly, and particularly if you listen to the German ambassador, who's got quite a sizable bee in his bonnet about this, youth mobility is the thing that will unlock the negotiations. The danger going forward, I think, is that both the UK and the EU look at the renegotiation and think, actually, is it worth the bother? Because the stakes are actually so small in terms of what Labour is asking for. And I think one way of opening up the talks is to make the stakes higher, which takes me back to where I began. In the current context, with what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in the United States, having closer relations between us and the European Union is existential. We need to figure out ways to defend ourselves together, and actually having thriving economies is becoming a security issue, because without them, we're not going to be able to afford to defend ourselves together. So one of the interesting things I think to watch over the next weeks and months is whether the stakes are raised Because I think if they aren't, and if this reset remains technical, the danger is it'll fizzle out in a sort of puff of low expectations and a lack of inspiration on either side. That's my 7 minutes. I make it.
That's great, Anand. I mean, amazing to kind of come in under time rather than above time. I mean, given that we've got a little bit more time, I'm really interested to hear you kind of just unpick what's happened in the last month, I suppose, and your sense of where that is going to take that. Has that opened up some conversations that wouldn't previously have been possible just because of what the alternative is? What's your kind of sense from the conversations that you've been having, especially in the past month, about
I mean, my sense is that, if I was to characterize, and it's very easy being outside government, governing is hard. Governing in a time when there's no money and there are global threats is incredibly hard. So, I'm not saying any of this is easy or should be easy, but I sort of see the government in a sense as being in a kind of defensive crouch on all fronts now, being quite sort of minimalist in what it's trying to do, being overly cautious. And there is a bit of me that thinks, for Christ's sake, you've got a majority of 170. If you don't use it now, you're going to look back in 4 years' time when your backbenchers start getting querulous and think, God, we wasted an opportunity, which is exactly what Tony Blair did after his first term. Actually, he looked back and thought, I could have done more. Now, I'm not convinced that dealing with the UK-EU relationship should necessarily be a priority. I mean, there are all sorts of things. If I had a 170-seat majority and said to me, what would you do? I'd say I'd reform council tax as a first priority, start taxing wealth in a proper way. So there are lots of good things you could do outside of the reset, but the reset is strange in the sense that Labour have talked a good game, but it's hard to avoid the impression now that all that time in opposition, they didn't really come up with a plan and are not really sure about the specifics of what they're after or how they're going to achieve them. And I think the danger of the summit is, for me, the summit needs to do two things. You need to deliver something. Okay, you need to come up with something wrapped in a bow and say, look what we've got here. And you need to deliver a sense of momentum, which is, apart from this thing in a bow, we've also made plans. We've started agreeing X, and within 3 months we will get together again and agree it properly and sign it off. And I think without that forward momentum, without that sense that we are doing things, my fear is that this rather fizzles out because, God knows, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are going to have a number of big problems to deal with over the next few years. And the danger is that this gets drowned out.
Yeah. And indeed, they've got a number of big problems already. And I absolutely agree with you both on a bunch of things that they could have and should have been doing. And also just on that issue of timidity, particularly with such a huge majority, we may have questions around that, or indeed a further speaker to chip in on that. But I think I'd like to move over. Thanks so much, Anand. That's really helpful. And we'll definitely be coming back to you with some questions from the floor shortly. But Alexandra Hall, I'd like to kind of bring you in here. And of course, you've got a particular insight into the sort of the US-UK dynamics and how that feeds into all of this. So the floor is yours for the next 8 minutes. Let us know what you think.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I must say, I seem to make terribly bad personal choices, volunteering to be Brexit councillor in Washington and then deciding to take out US citizenship just before Trump became president. So wow. you can assess my judgment on all those things. But I think in framing how the UK and the EU relationship will be going forward, I think we do have to recognise that this is no longer a technical discussion about widgets and barriers and regulations. This is now a geopolitical necessity to reset the relationship between the UK and the EU because the geopolitical environment has changed. And I think that although there are tremendous risks given the strains in the transatlantic relationships, for people who support a closer realignment between the UK and the EU, this is also a tremendous opportunity, but it's one that's being forced upon us. And so I think we have to have that debate in that wider geopolitical context. So I live in Washington. It is really hard for me to convey quite how bad it is. It is really bad. It is as bad as all of you have been reading, and it's going to get worse. And it's not so much because a new government is wrong to reassess government spending, to want to realign its foreign policy priorities or its aid priorities. It is really the way in which the Trump administration is going about business. It is completely driving a coach and horses through America's system of checks and balances. It is defying court orders. It is ignoring the independent status of agencies which are set up to hold governments to account, or inspectors. It is deliberately targeting agencies and individuals that might constrain the freedom of action of this administration. So inspectors, regulators, experts, scientists, academics, the media, think tanks will be next, universities will be next. It's taking over ownership of agencies like the Federal Communications Commission that governs how media can operate. It is intimidating people who oppose them. You have Musk on Twitter able to set his army of trolls on people who oppose them. It is vengeful on a very personal level. For example, removing security protection from national security experts like John Bolton or Brian Hook, who face a real threat of assassination from Iran. And it's very petty. It is like a toddler throwing toys out of a pram. So one example that caught my eye was Trump's decree that people must use plastic straws and that paper straws should not be used anymore. And there is no logic on that other than pettiness and spite. So I was at a rally in DC the day before yesterday with federal workers and USAID workers and people concerned about the state of American democracy. And the one thing that came up again and again and was the sort of chant was, where is Congress? Do your job. Where is Congress? Grow some spine. And that is, I think, what is really frightening, is the checks and balances that US citizens have relied upon have turned out, just like the guardrails in the unwritten British Constitution turned out to be utterly meaningless when you have someone in charge who is determined to bulldoze their way through. And then you've seen on the international level a complete reversal of the US approach on Ukraine, on relationships with Russia. The EU is seen as an enemy. Canada and Mexico are seen as problems. Russia and China are big power players who the US wants to strike deals and bargains with. So everything is being upended. So where does that leave the UK? The risk that we always had with Brexit was that the UK would end up sort of bobbing alone, isolated in the mid-Atlantic, while the US and the EU forged closer cooperation without us. And that was happening already under Biden. And then the Ukraine conflict brought us all back together a little bit, admittedly in an ad hoc way, but the UK began to work very well again with the EU and the US on Ukraine. But now we're in a much worse situation, which is a rupture in transatlantic relationships. And we risk now being caught in that crossfire. And I think it is a huge conceit and a grotesque presumption by Keir Starmer to sort of try and claim that he can act as a bridge between the EU and the US. There is no evidence that either side wants us to do this. We're not in the EU. We can't speak for the EU. And Trump's interests are completely different, which is to try and prize the UK away from the EU and sow more divisions within the EU. And it completely overplays the extent to which we have influence. So I think it's very presumptuous. And the real challenge for Keir Starmer is how to avoid burning our bridges, because the UK, frankly, is too small to go it alone. Geography, values, economic interests dictate that we must have a relationship and rebuild our relationship with Europe. But we have become so dependent on the US for our security that we can't afford to rupture that relationship as well. So we are going to have to try and keep channels open to both sides. Nevertheless, I would argue, and as Anand has suggested, and as some of the comments in the chat suggest, we don't want to make these hard choices. But the way Trump is acting is forcing us to make some choices, and inevitably the balance is shifting towards the EU. It is not just that we can no longer rely upon America as our security partner. It's the fact that we're not even sure we share the same interests. And even more fundamentally, I'm not even sure we share the same values as the US. So that is not a sustainable relationship. Whereas we do share the same interests with the EU, we do by and large share the same values, and our security interests are intertwined. So the UK has to focus on rebuilding its relationship with the EU. In the process, I would argue, that also increases our options vis-a-vis the US and gives us more leverage rather than being completely isolated. And in order to make that happen, I think both the EU and the UK need to grow up a bit. We need to stop. We need to be willing to drop some of our red lines. From the UK's point of view, we have to stop being so neuralgic about the European Court of Justice, about whether a youth mobility scheme opens the door to freedom of movement when clearly it doesn't. We should be willing to consider dynamic alignment on regulations to facilitate better trade. We need a better trading relationship because if we're going to increase our defence expenditure, we need to get our economy moving again. And the best way we can do that is improving our trading relationships with the EU. But I also think the EU, given this changing geopolitical context, they have to stop treating the UK as if we are just another third country, like any other, and that we can't be allowed privileged access to structured relationship and dialogues on foreign policy and defence issues, that somehow if they allow us to cooperate on defence procurement, research and development, that's setting a bad precedent. We are not a third country like any other. There are very good historical reasons why the UK and the EU have a mutual interest in improving cooperation on foreign policy and defence. So just to conclude, I think Brexit was always at some point going to pose some hard choices on us. That moment is now here. It can't be dodged any longer. When Starmer comes to Washington next week, I don't envy him the task. He mustn't let the US drive wedges between us and the EU. He can't kowtow too much to Trump. That will only lose his respect, and it might buy us a bit more time, but it won't let us off the hook. We mustn't sell out the EU. We have to stand up for our principles. So I think I'm going to end there.
Thanks, Alexandra. That's really helpful and certainly a very sobering. Not that we needed more sobering, to be honest, about the situation, but you've been very clear and direct about that. I think you've made a very interesting point about the hubris of the UK seeking to be a bridge between America and the EU when we are no longer part of the EU. And while you were talking, I was just visualizing this very uncomfortable kind of combination of fence sitting and that thing where you've got one foot on something that's drifting one way and one foot drifting the other way, and you're going to end up in a very, very uncomfortable position. I think I suppose I want to ask you just briefly, I know we're short of time, but you were talking about shared interests and values, and obviously the EU itself is under a degree of pressure in terms of what we might have historically thought of as shared values, the rise of the right within Europe. Do you think that one of the things that might help to bring Britain and the EU a bit closer together is a recognition that the UK playing a stronger part within those relationships can help to counterbalance some of those countervailing forces that are rising in some parts of the EU?
So I do think that one problem that has really beset Europe is the lack of good leadership and the lack of strong voices able to push back on disinformation and to speak up in a very clear way. And I think Keir Starmer, as Anand was saying, has been a bit too cautious. I thought the remarks he gave, I think it was outside the Elysee Palace on Monday, were absolutely great, actually, where he did give a kind of address to the British public. I feel like this is a moment for addresses to the British nation in the kind of way that presidents do, explaining the stakes here. and why this is no longer a nuts and bolts discussion, a technical discussion about our relationship with the EU. This is the gravest challenge to European security since the end of the Second World War. And we have no choice but to increase our cooperation. I do think our leaders need to have a bolder discussion about immigration, which is one of the issues that far-right parties are able to weaponize. I think we need to be cooperating closer with our European partners on immigration, and we need to be willing to talk about the challenges posed by immigration. And we need to be standing up for our principles, and we need to be going back to first principles, reminding people about the circumstances of World War II, the dangers of selling out individual countries, the importance of our values, and pushing back. And I think we need to have the courage to do that. And I think the UK can be a voice in that. I do think Starmer, the tone he struck on Monday night was very, very good. His willingness to offer UK troops for Ukraine, even though I do worry if our armed forces are large enough to do that. But if Europe wants to be on the table and to be counted, if it wants to be at the table rather than on the table, it has to bring assets to that table. And one of the reasons we're in this terrible mess and Europe is being sidelined is because we did allow ourselves to become weak and irrelevant. We need to make ourselves relevant again.
Thanks, Alexandra. That's great. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. In fact, I know there are lots of questions coming in. I want to move to Mark Kieran, though, now. Mark, we'd love to hear what you have to say. And I mean, perhaps you could also weave into your comments any observations you have in terms of how clear the messaging you feel the UK government has been giving in relation to, current American pronouncements and how that reflects on this question after 5 years of Brexit. What lies ahead?
Well, I intend to make a specific point, which some of the viewers may be surprised about, but it really does underpin everything that's been discussed here. It's the point that where we go in the future, overturning Brexit and resetting our relationship with the EU is built on our equally important need to sort out our democracy. I think the Brexit wasn't just a terrible political decision. It was a symptom of our broken democracy. And I have taken the view for a long time, and indeed Open Britain's strategy is that if we are ever going to succeed in reversing Brexit, then part of our plan has to be to fix our democracy. It's clear. I think most people can see Brexit's failures now, on the economy, on trade, on Britain's reputation within the world, countless other ways. But if we don't accept the major role that our broken democracy played in it, then we risk seeing history repeat itself and next time round and not being able to fix the problem. And I think there will be an opportunity in the future. I don't know whether that's going to be in the short, medium, or long term, but we will have a chance to have our say on this again in the future. And when we do, we absolutely must ensure that the will of the people can't be hijacked by dark money, disinformation, and minority vested interests in the way that it was last time. And that is the core objective that Open Britain is working towards at the moment, fixing democracy, because we see the fight to rejoin the EU and the fight for democracy that genuinely works for ordinary people as two fronts in the same battle. Rejoining Europe is going to be possible. Rejoining the EU is going to be possible, but we have to start preparing now if we're going to be able to exploit that opportunity when it comes. We can't just carry on with a lame democracy that ignores the will of ordinary people and allows Nigel Farage and his friends to decide Britain's future. We will never escape from this Brexit trap if that's what we do. And it's worth remembering Brexit. The media tell us this, and politicians these days, some politicians, Ellie, not all, say that Brexit was the will of the people. It's what the country wanted. It wasn't. It happened because of a small group of very determined people rigged the system over a long period of time in their favour. The right-wing media spent decades undermining the EU and with lies and specious claims that Brussels was cheating us Brits out of our birthright, even though we were at the heart of the thing and key players and actually had a pretty good deal as things went. It was partly because our voting system encouraged politicians to focus on small groups of influential voters who happened to be in the right place to swing election results that they wanted. It was because the Brexit campaign was flooded with untraceable donations, dark money as we call it. It's easy to forget now, but can you remember the wrappers that were on the Metro newspapers funded by the DUP because Northern Ireland has slightly less stringent rules on election spending, and even to this day, I was talking to Peter Gagan last week. We still don't know where that money came from. That's outrageous, really. And the disinformation that we saw, the propaganda, the classic 350 million for the NHS on the side of the bus, the posters suggesting Turkey was about to join the EU. They weren't sort of run-of-the-mill political campaign slogans. They were deliberate and carefully calibrated lies. They were crafted to get us to take a decision that wasn't necessarily, as things have turned out, clearly wasn't in our best interest. So this isn't just about the reversal of a past policy decision, which often the right sort of say that it is. It's really more fundamental. I see it as a question of whether Britain is actually a functioning democracy, and we need to do a number of things before we try to get back into the European Union. I think cleaning up politics, removing the dark money from politics is absolutely essential. The importance of that has become even clearer in recent weeks with the speculation around Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, giving a game-changing amount of money to reform. We have to be alive to the impact that would have on British politics and any big question like rejoining the EU. We have to stop social media poisoning the public debate and hold the platforms accountable for their role in that. Disinformation is an incredibly powerful thing now, and it's the people who are opposing us in our intent to get back into the EU understand the power of it and how to use it. And third and by no means least is the voting system, because first past the post carries all sorts of unfairnesses, but the key thing about it from the anti-Brexit perspective is that it brings volatility and uncertainty to politics. And so it is entirely possible under first past the post that we would flip-flop and we could go and ask the EU to start conversations about us rejoining. And I'm pretty sure, given the pain of the last Brexit process, they would say, before we get into this, can you just assure us that there isn't going to be a different group of people knocking on our door in 5 years' time asking us for the exact opposite of what you're now asking for. And under first past the post, we can't really give that assurance. But under PR, looking at where we are, where the public views are, and where the young people are, and how demographics are going to change, I think we probably could say that. So, that's why I say that any discussion about rejoining the EU has to be considered at the same time as considering how we fix our democracy. And I think that European movements, supporters, anybody who's involved in this fight needs to also look at how we can change democracy and get on board with that agenda as well. I think that's probably my time, Ellie.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's really helpful, and certainly a strong kind of critical analysis of what got us to here, and the wider lessons, I suppose, for our struggling democracy and political system, much of which I of course agree with you about. I suppose I'm left thinking, flipping heck, it's all pretty bad, isn't it? So I'd like to kind of briefly invite you to kind of offer us a little chink of light at the end of the tunnel. We're in a difficult position currently in politics. You've outlined just the broader implications of the situation that we're in, what are the things that give you some degree of hope that, you know, a better future could lie ahead?
Well, I think it's talking to ordinary people. But when I read the media, read the newspapers and watch the TV, the world the country as it's described to me there isn't the country that I experience when I talk to people. I mean, I mentioned to the participants, to the panel members before we came on air, that I live in rural Lincolnshire. Well, as you would imagine, living here, I'm exposed on a daily basis to some pretty strong views about Brexit and the way the country's working. And lots of people say to me, it was a mistake. We shouldn't have believed the stuff we were told. A lot of the people who work in Open Britain are young people, very bright young people with their lives ahead of them. And they talk about Brexit as a massive mistake, and they want to overturn it. I think it's a sort of settled issue in lots of people's minds. And I think if we had a democratic system that allowed the will of the people genuinely to shine through, I think we would be making progress. Now, that's perhaps not as optimistic a view as you were fishing for, Ellie, but I take that as a positive. I think this is just about getting the system to reflect the will of the people, and then we'll be able to make some progress on this issue and lots of others, actually.
Well, as a politician, I do believe that politics is kind of part of the solution as well as part of the problem. So, I always encourage people to kind of throw themselves into it and, try and make change using that system. Right. Questions. Somebody techie behind the scenes, is going to bring up questions along here. Now, those of you posing questions, gentle reminder, we did ask you to say who you would like to direct a question to. We're not going to have enough time to direct every question to every panel member. So we've got one here from Barbara Callender. Could the panel members suggest how best they think we can get our clear message to the government regarding closer cooperation with the EU? Who'd like to take that? Show me your hands, panel members. Okay, Anand, go for it.
I mean, the way to make government pay attention is to make them think it's in their political interests to act differently. And at the moment, that's enormously problematic because the Lib Dems have obviously changed their approach to both Europe and America after the election of Donald Trump. They've done it very noisily. They've done it very clearly. The problem is I think there's one Labour Lib Dem marginal seat in the country. So, as far as the Labour Party are concerned, this is a fight that the Lib Dems can have with the Conservatives. It doesn't really affect them. It is actually quite hard at the moment to find a way to make Labour feel as threatened by the pro-European side as it does by the reform side. And I think that's what needs to happen for government policy to be made to shift. At the moment, I don't think it's simply not in their political interests as they see it to move further or faster on this.
Really interesting point there, Anand. Mark, have you got anything you'd like to chip in with on this?
No, Anand has said it, actually.
Yeah, very wise, Anand. Thank you. Can we have the next question, please? Another one for you, Anand. There you go. There's a sense of regret and hapless Tory leadership. Might the One Nation Tories reclaim the party and argue to rejoin the customs union? Ka-ching, Tories back in power. Feasible? Question mark.
I mean, if the last 10 years tells us anything, it's that anything is feasible. I find that incredibly unlikely at the moment, not least given what we know about the Conservative Party membership who ultimately are responsible for electing their leader. And the other thing I would say, I mean, just to add to the gloom, is if I were the European Union, I would not sit down and negotiate anything sweeping with the UK until there was broad cross-party agreement. There's no point negotiating some massive change of status with a Labour government if you know that a change of government would lead to everything being unpicked. So I think actually changing the Conservative Party is a necessary precondition for a significant change in our status with regard to the European Union. It's just I find that change very hard to foresee at the moment.
And and that point you made about changeability, Mark made exactly that same point. It's really hard, particularly in our political system, to have a degree of kind of sense of consensus about long-term strategic policy direction, and indeed that applies to all sorts of other policy areas as well.
Exactly. And with the polarization of the country as well, that just increases the impact of the uncertainty and the volatility. And I just can't imagine that they'd want to go through all of that pain again unless there was a pretty certain reassurance that it wasn't all going to be wasted.
Thank you. Let's have the next question. I'm reading these out because I think that there will be some people who are listening to this and not able to see the tiny writing on the bottom of the screen. So we've got a question from Alexandra, from Jeremy Thomas. How do we convince the average Reform voter that we are more aligned with Europe than the US?
I usually like questions. That one's really tough. I don't think we can. I mean, I think, unfortunately, the average Reform voter doesn't think that. They think that Trump is their guy and is speaking out against all this woke nonsense and all this transgender nonsense and against immigration, and that Europe is weak and divided. I don't think we convince the average Reform voter. I think we have to convince the average voter and marginalize the Reform Party.
Interesting, Alex. Can I gently kind of push back on that a little bit, actually?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, and I don't have all the stats at my fingertips, but my kind of vague recollection is that a lot of Reform voters are kind of actually really supportive of the NHS, really supportive of public ownership of utilities like water, you know, kind of wanting a functioning kind of a functioning British state. And certainly my own experience in terms of doorstep politics is that there's a lot of frustration driven Reform voting, a kind of, you know, rebellion, I suppose, or a pushing back against traditional party politics. That's certainly what I found during the general election campaign. So yeah, maybe there's some scope for hope there. I don't know.
Well,
Alexander?
I mean, I will say one thing is, I mean, my impression is that Trump is actually very unpopular in most of the UK, and that there's also bipartisan, sorry, that's an American term. There's also pretty good support for Ukraine across the political spectrum in the UK. In the US, a lot of Trump voters are waking up to the cold reality that what they voted for is beginning to hurt them as well, because it turns out he's going after veterans' benefits and social security payments and firing a lot of federal workers who live outside Washington. And so his attacks on the establishment is turning out to be an attack on them as well. And so it's also possible that the average Reform voter will look at what's happening in the US and think, actually, hang on, this isn't entirely, you know, we can see this isn't actually that great. So there may be an education process. I mean, there's a sense here in Washington that, although I said at the beginning, this is all going to get a lot worse, there's also a sense that this is just not going to last for 4 years. Something very bad is going to happen. This is all going to blow up quite spectacularly, because the damage that is being done, I mean, it's going to take a long time to pick up the pieces, even after only a month. But they are driving such a wrecking ball through the US workforce and agencies. I mean, there's a measles outbreak in Texas. There is a bird flu outbreak. They've been firing the Food and Drug administrators. We've had plane crashes. They're firing people from the Federal Aviation. They fired people from the Nuclear Watchdog Agency, which they then tried to crawl back. They are firing people from the CIA, the FBI, and government intelligence agencies. That opens scope for a hostile terrorist action. There is a sense that you know, this could blow up spectacularly badly soon as well. I mean, this onslaught cannot survive. I mean, at some stage, something's going to go so badly wrong, there'll be a pushback.
Thanks, Alexandra. Yet more sobering.
Well, no, I see that as a good thing. I'm kind of hoping that happens.
Okay. Thank you. Next question we have from Sarah Fannett. Could you be more specific on fixing our broken democracy? Mark, I think this one's for you.
Yeah, it looks like it.
System. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the fundamentals, there are lots of things that we need to do. But Open Britain and Fair Vote, the two organizations that I'm involved with, are very closely involved in the creation of the APPG for Fair Elections, which of course Ellie is one of the vice chairs of. And we decided that the three main objectives had to be changing the voting system from first past the post to a form of PR, taking dark money out of the system and undue influence that comes with it, and combating disinformation in public discourse. There's a long tail of other things that we ought to be doing. Certain things around the Electoral Commission, giving them back their true independence, giving them some extra powers to actually investigate some of the issues that they've not really been able to investigate in the past. But it's those three things. If we can get a grip on the dark money that's flooding through the system and the disinformation that's polluting the debate, then at least we can be sure that we can give people information, they can process that information reasonably, and they can come to a reasonable conclusion about how they want to vote. What is the sort of world that they want to be delivered via their votes? And if we have a PR system, then it will be a better representation of what people really want than first past the post.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, absolutely. And I know that there's a more detailed kind of report available from the APPG's website, isn't there?
Yes, free but not fair. It's available on the APPG's website to download. PDF is there.
Thank you. Next question, techie people. Thank you. Christopher Kelly says, to all of you, I support rejoining the EU, but what if the price was to join the euro and or Schengen? There's an assumption that the UK would be welcomed back, but is that true? Even EFTA wasn't keen on UK. Who'd like to go there? I mean, Anand, I think you talked about not necessarily assuming that the EU is all that keen to have us back necessarily, given the trouble.
No, I think, and as I said, I think unless we have something close to bipartisan agreement between the two main parties that is what they wanted, I think it'd be very hard for the EU to sit down and negotiate with us. I think, on the euro, I mean, Sweden is legally committed to join the euro, but they seem to be staying out of it quite well, despite that legal commitment. So what you sign up to and what you do can be two different things. And I wonder about Schengen, whether it will be imposed on us, because being an island makes an enormous difference. I think that was one of the arguments when we were in. So, there's no doubt that the deal we get won't be as good as the deal we had. I mean, we're not going to get the rebate, and there's a lot of stuff that's changed in the European Union that I think we would have tried to stop since we left. I mean, it's amazing actually just how quickly the EU has changed quite fundamentally since we've left. But I just think the politics here is the real issue, rather than any details of the terms of negotiation.
Right. Thank you.
Although, Ellie, I just say I think these are the issues that come into play with the disinformation end of things. We've already seen responses raising these as definite. This is what the EU will impose on us as a condition of joining. No basis for that sort of comment really in terms of real substance. But that's where this sort of stuff will really have an impact, because you could see Elon Musk posting something apparently very definitive about this and very certain, and it would start to sway the debate even before it got started. So that's a good illustration of why we need to have a grip on the dark money disinformation side of things, so we can have a fair debate.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, by definition, a negotiation, everybody starts with their own positions. The whole point of a negotiation is you come to somewhere in the middle. But like Anand said, we're negotiating from a position of weakness relative to where we were previously. Yeah, Anand?
I don't think when you negotiate with the EU, you end up anywhere near the middle. I mean,
no.
You end up
one against 27, right?
You end up very, very near where the EU started.
Yeah, good point. Next question,
School
please.
of Negotiation.
Kim Thomas, can the UK secure a 180/365 travel agreement to the Schengen zone rather than the 90 and 180 days we currently have, so we at least have the same deal as Europeans have who travel to the UK? Parity? ? Anand, you're already on the screen.
A couple of things. One, I think it'd be a sensible thing for them to negotiate. But again, I think the Labour government would think, which sort of people are we trying to help here? And are they our core constituency? So I wonder. I mean, it's interesting, the asymmetry between how we're treated and how we treat Europeans. But remember, one of the reasons why, in fact, the only reason why we have an asymmetry when it comes to using the e-gates, so we let Europeans use the e-gates here and they don't let us use them there, was simply because we took the decision that we couldn't be bothered to hire enough border guards to do it any other way. So it was simply a cost-saving thing rather than a principle thing on our side. Anything is negotiable within reason. But I think the key thing about a negotiation with the European Union, as I said before, is the EU is relatively happy with the status quo in economic terms. And so we have to make it worth their while to enter into a negotiation on something like that.
Mm-hmm. And that's a classic issue of, you could kind of, in terms of the UK political kind of framing of it, you could actually frame it either way. You could frame it like you've said of, who's this going to benefit actually? Is it a kind of society-wide benefit? No, maybe not. On the other hand, you could frame it as, hang on, guys, this is about fairness. This is about parity and kind of, seizing UK, kind of the UK being treated in an equal way, which could generate kind of political support around it. But as you say, perhaps not the key battle that the government wants to engage in at the moment. Red Devil with lots of numbers. For Anand, again, why are Labour so frightened of rejoining the EU when clearly opinion has massively changed?
Well, I think on opinion, it has massively changed in the sense that more people than ever think it was a bad decision. More people than ever say they would rejoin if they had a vote. If you sit in a focus group and say, do you fancy going through that again? Most people disappear under the table. I mean, that's the problem, is people think it's a very British situation, isn't it? We've taken a decision, we regret it, but ultimately we really don't want to go through that process again at the moment. There's no appetite for it. So I think for Labour just won a massive majority in an election without talking about the EU. So I think if I were a Labour strategist, I'd be thinking, well, if it ain't broke, why fix it? And there's no obvious short-term electoral benefit for Labour in doing this. And of course, even if you're saying, okay, if we were to rejoin the single market or the EU, there'd be an economic benefit, it would take years for that economic benefit to feed through. And, as we discussed before, talking about broken politics, one of the things about our politics that is broken is that everything is so short-termist and seen in a 4-year political time span.
Yeah, which feeds right back into the point that Mark was making. Absolutely. I mean, I suppose that to kind of gently, I totally take your point about I can imagine that for some there's this kind of calculation that the political kind of actually re-engaging in any of those conversations is not where they want to go. So even though it's a really bad situation, we're stuck. But I have kind of raised this myself in some conversations when, you've got a chancellor saying growth is the kind of primary thing. And you just think, well, what is the biggest kind of shooting ourselves in the foot growth-wise that's happened in the last few years? And there are actually some options on the table for tackling that directly. Would it really take years to kind of recoup some of that damage that has been done if we rebuilt and, some of those economic relationships more closely?
I mean, I'd come back on that and say, actually, for a lot of companies now, the last thing they want is another disruption, even given the hassle that Brexit is creating. A lot of the trade associations are saying, just give us some peace and quiet now to get on with doing what we're doing. Stop changing the bloody rules. Give us a bit of certainty. So there are going to be adjustment costs. It's not, in the same way that leaving the EU wasn't an economic cliff edge, rejoining isn't going to be whatever the opposite of a cliff edge is, the positive thing.
Magic wand.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. It's going to take time. It will take negotiations for the terms to get in the first place. I personally think the EEA route is simply not viable for a country like the United Kingdom, because I think the notion of being a rule taker across the board will cause such problems politically here. So, I just think, and Labour are thinking we need growth by 2029. Okay. And so they're not thinking we need to go through a 5-year accession negotiation process and we'll see the next time.
Yeah, I'm going to haul myself back from the temptation to get into a wonky conversation about Labour's growth policy, because I know we're running short of time. So we will whiz on to another question or two. For Alexandra, do we need to prepare for when Trump decides that his term of office needs to be extended because he is God's choice? Martin.
It's really awful, but I've been thinking about getting myself a prepper's handbook, those sort of how to survive the apocalypse and build my bunker. And because this is America, maybe stocking up on some guns.
I mean, I'm taking that with that your tongue is in your cheek at that point.
Well, no, it has actually crossed my mind. I mean, it is actually very frightening when you've got these January 6th hostages, as he called them, out on the streets. I do worry that this could turn politically violent. I do worry about something blowing up here. So I don't know if Trump will extend his term of office. I've heard that there's talk of him doing a Medvedev-Putin solution where
That's exactly what I was thinking at that moment, yeah.
And then Trump becomes the vice president and they do this sort of bait and switch. I think the main thing is it's a little bit like the discussion we've had about dealing with China. I think we need to de-risk and decouple. We need to wean ourselves off being quite so dependent on America and a little bit more resilient so that whatever happens in America, we've insulated ourselves a little bit from those effects, which again points to the logic of rebuilding relations with the EU, reaching out to our other Five Eyes partners and sort of broadening our options. And I saw somewhere in the comments, somebody said, should we make this more about security than about trade? I mean, they're interlinked in that a strong economy will allow more resources to improve our security. But I do think the discussion with Europe needs to be reframed as a geopolitical one rather than nuts and bolts of Brexit, even if that's what the details need to be. But as long as we think about it in purely these nuts and bolts terms, we're missing the whole point. And the EU itself was always designed as a kind of security project through economic means. And so, yes, I do think security is a better way of thinking about it.
Thanks. I think that's a really important point, and it's, you know, so fascinating that things have shifted so hugely in terms of that, and it's really concentrating all of our minds. Next and last question from Richard Wilson: with the USA effectively abandoning Europe, does this represent a game changer in terms of the UK's national interest vis-a-vis the EU? I mean, this is a continuation really of the same theme, isn't it? I think we've got 30 seconds each if you'd like to kind of wrap up on that. Alexandra, you go first and then we'll take the other two panelists.
I think it's a game changer in our relationship with the US. Whether we can go so far as to rejoin the EU, unfortunately, as Anand has also said, I mean, the EU itself is changing. And whether we want to fully rejoin, whether any British politician can make that case, but there is definitely a geopolitical game changer in terms of cooperating with the EU, without doubt.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I would say absolutely it does represent a game changer, but I would struggle to say in what way or where it will lead us. I think there are just so many moving parts now and so much uncertainty. And my wife is American, and so I'm got in-laws over there. I've been pretty well plugged into the American political system for a while, and even I have been astonished at the degree of chaos that Trump has brought and the speed with which he's implemented things and the apparent lack of coherence in the plans that he's executing. So yes, I think it's a game changer, but I have no idea where it's going to take us, unfortunately.
Thanks, Mark. And Anand?
I think if the US abandons Europe, then yes, it would be a game changer. We don't know yet what the US is planning to do. The US hasn't reneged on NATO. The US hasn't said it's going to withdraw all its troops from Europe. I imagine we'll end up with a slightly messier situation than an all-out abandonment. But short of that, there are still difficult choices for the UK's national interest. I mean, I noticed that the UK didn't sign up to the AI declaration from the Paris summit recently. And at a certain point, people on the European continent are going to start thinking, well, you're either with us or against us. I mean, think back to 1967 when de Gaulle vetoed our application. He said the UK will be a Trojan horse for American interests in Europe. And that was when we were allies. OK, so I think the danger for the UK is that if this becomes an us or them thing, I think it's perfectly sensible for Keir Starmer to try and avoid making a choice. The danger is he's forced to make a choice, and that's a really uncomfortable situation to be in for us.
Thanks, Anand. Yes, and I think this is a really interesting point to end on. From my perspective, and I've said this in a number of arenas, including in the House, I personally find it frustrating, to be honest, that we don't have a stronger UK voice standing up for what are British values. And I think that we're going to be fighting a lost cause if we're trying to placate Trump in this environment at the moment. We're going to have to stop there. It is 7:30. I am hugely grateful to our fantastic panelists tonight, Anand Menon, Alexandra Hall, and Mark Kieran. Thank you so much to everybody who's been here with us tonight, listening, contributing to the conversation with your questions. Apologies if we didn't manage to get to your particular question. And as we've said, the link will be available from tomorrow. Thank you all and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.